In a world where strength is often measured by the power of the body, there exists a deeper truth that few can see. This is the story of a transformative journey, a quest that begins with muscles and ends with wisdom. May these words awaken in you the courage to find the true power that lies beyond the visible. The sun had barely risen when the sounds of heavy breathing already echoed through the courtyard of the ancient monastery. While most monks still rested in their quarters or silently began their morning meditations, a young monk was striking a worn wooden post over and over again. His fists, hardened by calluses and determination, created a steady rhythm that blended with the songs of the birds announcing the new day. His body, sculpted by years of relentless dedication, told stories of physical discipline that few could match. Broad, well-defined back muscles, the result of thousands of push-ups. Legs as strong as stone pillars, formed by countless squats. Arms marked by prominent veins, shaped by carrying buckets of water up the mountain day after day, season after season. Every visible muscle beneath his simple robe was a testament to what he believed to be only path to true strength. In the mountains, where the wind whispered ancient secrets and silence had depth, this stone monastery housed dozens of seekers. But none embraced the physical path with as much passion as this young monk. While others spent hours contemplating the movements of their own minds, he preferred to move stones, lift beams, and run against the cutting wind of the high altitudes. "The body is our first temple," he would often say to the novices who watched him in admiration. "Strengthen it, and you will have an unshakable foundation for any challenge life presents." At dawn, when the morning dew still kissed the leaves of the ancient trees surrounding the monastery, the young monk was already in motion. His bare feet left deep imprints in the damp earth as he carried stones from one side of the courtyard to the other. At noon, when the sun reached its peak and others sought shade and rest, he practiced balance postures on wooden pillars, his perfectly controlled body defying gravity. And in the evening, when the shadows stretched like deep thoughts, his precise martial movements cut through the air with lethal elegance. The old master of the monastery often observed him from a distance, his ancient eyes having witnessed the birth and death of many seasons, following each movement with a mixture of admiration and concern. There was undeniable beauty in the young monk's dedication, but there was also something missing, something essential that no physical training could develop. On a particularly hot afternoon, as the young monk took a brief rest after splitting enough firewood to warm the monastery for an entire week, the old master silently approached. "Why waste time sitting in silence when we can strengthen the temple that carries our soul?" the young monk asked bluntly, wiping the sweat from his sun-bronzed face. "Meditation does not keep anyone warm in winter, nor does it protect our walls from bandits." The old master smiled with the wisdom that only decades of practice can grant. He sat on a nearby stone and began to tell the story of the Enlightened One, who before finding the middle way, subjected himself to such severe physical austerities that his body became little more than skin and bones. "For 6 years, the master explained in a calm voice, the one who sought answers put his body through trials that would make even the most dedicated ascetic tremble. He ate only a single grain of rice a day. He exposed himself to the elements without protection. He remained so still for such long periods that birds built nests in his tangled hair." The young monk listened with genuine interest, for stories of physical endurance always fascinated him. And through this extraordinary discipline, the master continued, what did the seeker discover? That he needed to regain his strength to continue his quest. The young monk replied promptly, confident that his own philosophy was being confirmed by the story. The old master gazed at the distant mountains, their snow-covered peaks glistening under the afternoon sun. "Or perhaps," he said softly, "the strength he sought would not be found through the torment of the flesh." He told how the Enlightened One, after years of extreme physical self-discipline, realized that he was just as far from the truth as he had been in the days of indulgence in his palace. How he accepted food, regained his health, and sat beneath the Bodhi tree, not to demonstrate physical strength, but to observe his own mind with unwavering clarity. The young monk listened to the story with respect, as he always did when the master spoke. But in his heart, the lesson remained like a seed unplanted in soil not yet ready. His convictions were too strong, too deeply rooted in years of practice and visible results. "With all due respect, master," he finally said, rising to resume his training, "each must find their own path. Mine is forged through the body." The master did not argue. He simply watched as the young monk resumed his exercises with renewed intensity, as if he wanted to prove something, not only to others, but, above all, to himself. That night, as the stars appeared one by one in the darkening sky, the young monk continued training alone in the courtyard. His silhouette moved with grace and power against the horizon, each calculated motion reflecting years of meticulous practice. To any observer, it was a spectacle of human control and discipline. But in the depths of the night, when he finally retired for a brief rest, an unsettling thought followed him into his dreams, a simple question planted by the master's words. If ultimate strength resided only in the body, why had the enlightened one abandoned that path? This doubt, small as a grain of sand on a vast shore, would begin to form a pearl of wisdom, one that would take years to fully emerge. As days turned into weeks and weeks into months, the young monk continued his relentless pursuit of physical perfection. His reputation grew both within and beyond the monastery walls. Villagers from the mountains spoke of the monk whose strength seemed superhuman, whose hands could break stones, whose body appeared invulnerable to pain and fatigue. And so the years passed, like clouds drifting over the eternal mountains. Now at the peak of his physical prowess, the young monk decided it was time to test his strength in the world beyond the monastery. The test would come in the form of an ancient tournament held in the Valley City, where the most skilled warriors of the region gathered to showcase their mastery. The day of the tournament arrived, carrying the scent of anticipation in the air. The winding path descending from the mountains was filled with travelers heading to the valley to witness the event. That took place only once every 3 years. The young monk walked among them, his upright and confident posture drawing curious glances. His body, shaped by countless hours of rigorous training, moved with a grace that contrasted with his evident strength. The city buzzed with life. Merchants shouted, announcing their goods. Children ran, chasing one another through the colorful stalls, and the distant sound of drums set the growing rhythm of the festivities. The air carried the fragrance of spices, sweat, and anticipation. In the central square, a temporary arena had been built. Rustic stands surrounded a large circle of hardened earth where, soon, men would test their skills against one another. The young monk registered to compete, receiving doubtful looks from the organizers. Though his physique was impressive, his simple robe and bare feet seemed out of place among the warriors adorned with light armor and polished weapons. "A monk from the mountains?" asked the man writing down the participants' names. "Have you come to bless the fighters or to join them?" "I've come to learn," the monk replied simply, "and to test what I have already learned." The tournament preliminaries began at noon. The relentless sun scorched the arena, turning it into a furnace of dust and determination. The young monk watched each fight attentively, studying the combat styles, weaknesses, and strengths of every potential opponent. When his turn arrived, he stepped into the center of the circle with the calmness of a lake on a windless day. His first opponent was a burly man from the south, renowned for his overwhelming strength. The spectators murmured among themselves, placing bets on how long the monk would last before being brought down. To the crowd's surprise, it was the burly man who found himself on the ground within moments, his brute force overcome by the monk's precise technique. The following fights followed a similar pattern. Seasoned warriors, some with decades of battle experience, found themselves defeated by this stranger from the mountains who fought without anger, without fear, with movements that seemed to anticipate every attack. "He fights as if he were dancing with the wind," remarked an elderly woman selling medicinal herbs near the arena. Look at his eyes, they are not fixed on his opponent's body, but seem to see beyond, as if reading intentions before they turn into actions. As the day progressed, the crowd grew, drawn by rumors of the invincible monk. The young man remained unaffected by the attention, staying centered, drinking water sparingly between matches, and resting in the shade of a lone tree near the arena. By the time the sun began its descent on the horizon, only 2 competitors remained undefeated: the young monk and a man no one had expected to see in the final round. Among the noisy crowd, the monk observed his last opponent with curiosity. To his surprise, he found himself facing a man whose white hair and wrinkled hands told stories of many decades lived. The audience murmured with apprehension, fearing for the well-being of the elder who seemed too frail to be there. "This fight will be brief," thought the monk, feeling a tinge of disappointment. He had hoped for a greater challenge to crown his tournament experience. The 2 fighters positioned themselves at the center of the arena, now bathed in the orange glow of the late afternoon sun. The contrast between them could not have been greater. The young monk in his physical prime, well-defined muscles visible beneath his simple robe, and the old warrior, thin and seemingly fragile, with a serene smile that felt out of place in the setting of combat. The referee signaled the start of the final match. The monk advanced with the force of a controlled avalanche, his precise and powerful movements cutting through the air toward the elder. What happened next defied everything he believed he knew about strength and combat. The old warrior moved like water, flowing around each powerful strike with the grace of a stream weaving its way through rocks. His movements were economical, precise, almost imperceptible. Wherever the monk attacked, the elder was no longer there. When he countered, it seemed as though he exerted no force at all, merely redirecting the monk's own energy against him. Within moments, to the astonishment of everyone present, and no one more astonished than the monk himself, the young man found himself immobilized on the ground, tasting the bitter flavor of defeat for the first time in many years. "How?" he whispered, as the stunned silence of the crowd weighed in the air. The elder helped him to his feet and, in a voice as serene as deep water, replied, "You fight very well, young one. Your technique is excellent, your strength impressive. But you fight with your body, while I fight with my mind." The crowd began to disperse, but the monk remained, a new thirst stirring within his spirit. "Teach me," he asked the old warrior, setting aside for a moment all the pride that had accompanied him until then. The elder smiled and invited him to walk beyond the city, to a small grove where they could converse without the distractions and noise of the celebrations beginning in the square. Under the canopy of ancient trees, with the last rays of sunlight filtering through the leaves, the old warrior shared. The Enlightened One taught that the mind precedes all things. What we are today comes from our thoughts of yesterday, and our thoughts now shape our life tomorrow. He spoke of the Dhammapada, neither in the sky nor in the depths of the ocean, nor in the mountain's crevices is there a place where one can escape the consequences of an undisciplined mind. I spent my youth as you do, believing my muscles would protect me from all enemies. It was only when I lost everything, when my body was torn apart in battle, that I discovered the unshakable fortress of a cultivated mind. The monk listened with a newfound receptivity, born from the transformative experience of defeat. "How can I begin to cultivate this mind you speak of?" "Observe," the elder replied, pointing to a leaf dancing in the air, carried by a gentle breeze. "See how it does not resist the wind, but moves with it. It does not try to be stronger than the air, but understands its nature and becomes one with it. There lies the secret of true strength. They talked until the stars emerged in the sky. The old warrior sharing stories of battles lost and won, of defeats that taught more than victories, of how a serene mind sees clearly what a mind clouded by pride never can. When they finally parted, the young monk felt both lighter and heavier at the same time. Lighter because a burden had been lifted from his shoulders, the burden of believing that physical strength was the pinnacle of human development. Heavier because he now understood that the path ahead was far longer than he had ever imagined. The return to the monastery in the mountains was different from the descent. Each step was more mindful, each breath more full. He observed the nature around him with new eyes, not merely as a backdrop for his training, but as a master filled with silent lessons. When he finally glimpsed the familiar walls of the monastery against the mountain sky, the monk carried with him not a trophy of victory, but something infinitely more valuable, a deep unrest that had begun to transform the soil of his understanding, preparing it for seeds that, until then, had found no fertile ground in his heart. The following months were a period of subtle transition for the monk. Outwardly, he maintained his physical training routine, now tempered with periods of contemplative silence he had once considered a waste of time. Inwardly, a silent revolution was taking place, like the slow transformation of a seed beneath the soil, invisible to the eye, yet profound in its consequences. Winter arrived in the mountains with unusual ferocity, covering the monastery with a mantle of white silence. Training in the courtyard was replaced by practice within the heated halls. The monk noticed with curiosity how his body now responded differently as his mind became more actively engaged in training. Movements that had once required great effort seemed to flow more easily. Positions that had once caused tension now brought a sense of inner stability. "You are different," the old master observed during a joint practice session. "Something changed after your journey to the valley." The monk nodded but preferred silence over an explanation. Some transformations are so intimate that words can only diminish their magnitude. As spring emerged, bringing the first blossoms through the thawing snow, fate decided to offer a harsher lesson. What began as a simple joint pain quickly escalated into a fever that consumed him. Within days, the monk who had once carried stones as if they were feathers could no longer lift even a bowl of tea. The illness struck without warning, like a thief in the night. His limbs, once obedient to his every command, became unfamiliar rebels. His muscles, once a source of pride, now imprisoned him in a body that refused to respond. The fever lingered, resisting medicinal herbs and the prayers of his fellow monks. Lying in the silence of his quarters, staring at the ceiling day after day, he encountered an enemy his physical strength had never prepared him to face: despair. Like shadows stretching at dusk, dark thoughts began to invade the corners of his mind. What use is a strong body if it can be defeated by invisible enemies? What was the point of all that effort to build this physical temple if it can crumble so easily? These questions tormented him during long, sleepless nights when pain and fever were his only companions. While most monks took turns caring for him, it was an elderly healer nun from a neighboring monastery who assumed the main responsibility for his recovery. Her steps were as light as feathers on the wooden floor, her eyes as deep as wells of accumulated wisdom. As she applied herbal compresses to his feverish forehead, she brought something more valuable than any medicine: stories filled with ancient wisdom. "Do you know the story of the murderer who wore a garland of fingers?" she asked one morning as the sun painted golden patterns through the window. The old nun's voice had a musical quality that soothed even the most intense pain. He was a man of terrible strength, feared throughout the land. His speed was legendary, his muscles capable of crushing bones like dry twigs. The monk listened intently, grateful for the distraction from his miserable condition. Despite his weakness, his mind remained sharp. In fact, there were days when he felt his mind was clearer than it had ever been during his years of intense training. This murderer was called Angulimala, the nun continued, preparing an herbal infusion whose aroma filled the small room. He would cut a finger from each victim and wear them as a gruesome necklace. His reputation was so terrifying that entire villages emptied at the mere rumor of his approach. Her kind eyes met the monks as she went on. One day, Angulimala saw the Enlightened One walking serenely along a road. Determined to add another finger to his macabre collection, he ran to catch up with him. But something extraordinary happened. No matter how fast he ran, with all his unmatched physical strength, he could not get any closer to that serene figure who simply walked at a normal pace. How is that possible? The monk asked, his voice still weak. Exhausted and confused, Angulimala finally shouted, "Stop, ascetic!" To which the Enlightened One replied, "I have already stopped, Angulimala. It is you who are still running." The Enlightened One explained that he had stopped running in the cycle of causing suffering, while Angulimala was still propelled by his disturbed mind. It was not about physical speed, but about a mind at peace versus a mind in turmoil. The nun smiled at the thoughtful expression of the ailing monk. You see, all the physical strength in the world could not allow Angulimala to catch up with the Enlightened One, because the true obstacle was not in his feet, but in his mind. On the long nights of his recovery, these words echoed within the walls of the monk's mind. It is better to conquer yourself than to win 1,000 battles. Then the victory is yours. It cannot be taken from you by any power on earth or in heaven. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. The illness persisted, though its intensity gradually waned. It was a period of profound transformation for the monk. Deprived of his primary means of expression, physical movement, he was forced to explore inner territories he had neglected for years. Disease can be the greatest of teachers. The old nun told him on a particularly difficult afternoon when the frustration of his prolonged weakness had brought the monk to tears. On a sickbed, we cannot run from ourselves. We cannot distract ourselves with external activities. We are forced to face our fears, our limitations, our deepest truths. She then shared the story of another disciple of the Enlightened One who, struck by a terrible illness, received a visit from his master. When the Enlightened One asked about his well-being, the disciple responded with deep wisdom. The body suffers, but the mind does not suffer. How is that possible? The monk asked, genuinely intrigued, because he had learned to separate physical experience from mental reaction. Pain exists, yes, denying it would be foolish. But the additional suffering we create through our resistance, our anger, our self-pity, that is optional. It was a revelation for the monk. Throughout his adult life, he had completely identified with his body. His identity, his worth, his definition of strength, all were anchored in his physical ability. Now, lying in his sickbed, unable to perform even the simplest tasks without help, he was forced to ask, if I am not this body, then who am I? Slowly, as his body struggled to recover, a new understanding began to sprout like the first signs of spring after a long winter. Amidst the spasms of pain and moments of relief, he found spaces of clarity he had never experienced during his years of intense training. The mind is like water, the old nun explained as she helped him take his first steps outside his bed after months of confinement. When disturbed, it becomes cloudy and does not reflect clearly. When we allow it to settle, its true nature is revealed clear, transparent, capable of reflecting the world as it truly is. In the 3rd month of his convalescence, something extraordinary happened. During a morning meditation, a practice that had now naturally integrated into his day, the monk experienced a moment of clarity so profound that silent tears streamed down his face. It was as if, for the first time, he saw the world without the filter of his own projections and expectations. It is like waking up from a dream, he told the healer nun that afternoon. I spent years strengthening my body, believing it would strengthen me as a human being. Now I realize I was merely building a stronger fortress to house the same limited mind. The old nun smiled. Do not disregard your previous journey. Every step along the path has its purpose. Your dedication to the body developed precious qualities: discipline, perseverance, and awareness of your own limits. Now, these attributes will serve a new master your awakened mind. When summer returned to the mountains once more, the monk had regained much of his physical strength. He was no longer the man who could break stones with his bare hands, but his body, though leaner, radiated a different kind of vitality. It was as if an inner light now shone through his skin, illuminating his movements with a grace that stemmed not only from perfected technique. The experience of illness and recovery had planted a deep seed in his heart, a thirst for understanding that went beyond physical practices. The teachings of the old healer nun had opened the door to a realm he was only beginning to explore. One evening, as the monks gathered for their silent dinner in the monastery's refectory, the old master shared news of a hermit living on the sacred mountain of Koyama, 3 days' walk from the monastery. It was said that this man, known only as the mountain master by the local villagers, possessed such a profound understanding of the human mind that he could see the future and heal illnesses merely with his presence. Superstitious nonsense from simple folk, scoffed one of the elder monks, dismissing the stories as mere fantasy. But something in the description of the hermit resonated deeply in the recovering monk's heart. All through the night, while the others slept, he sat on his mat, contemplating the possibility of a journey to the sacred mountain. By dawn, his decision was made. With the blessing of the old master, who seemed to understand the necessity of this quest, without the need for many words, the monk prepared a small bundle with only the essentials for the journey. Seek with an open heart was the only advice the old master offered as they parted at the monastery gates. Answers rarely come in the form we expect. The path to the sacred mountain was arduous and lonely. For 3 days, the monk crossed deep valleys and climbed steep slopes, his not yet fully recovered muscles protesting against the effort. There were moments when the temptation to turn back and return to the comfort of the monastery was almost unbearable. Yet something kept driving him forward, an inexplicable certainty that this meeting with the mountain master was an essential part of his journey. During the cold nights, sleeping beneath the stars, he practiced the meditation techniques he had learned from the healer nun, allowing nature's stillness to soothe his anxious mind. On the morning of the 3rd day, when the sun was still just a promise on the horizon, he finally reached the peak where, according to what he had been told, he would find the hermit. To his surprise, there was no temple, no grand structure, just a small wooden hut, so simple that it nearly blended into the rocky landscape around it. The monk hesitated. After such a grueling journey, he had almost expected to find something grander, some outward sign that would confirm the extraordinary wisdom of the man he sought. Taking a deep breath to quell his disappointment, he stepped closer to the hut and knocked softly on the time-worn door. Long moments passed without a response. Just as he was about to knock again, the door opened, revealing an old man of utterly unremarkable appearance. Short, thin, with short gray hair, nothing about him suggested the miraculous powers the stories had attributed to him. "I have come to learn about true strength," the monk said, bowing in respect. The hermit observed him for a few moments, his dark, penetrating eyes seeming to see far beyond the surface. Then, without a word, he gestured for the monk to follow him. To the visitor's disappointment, there were no great revelations or profound teachings on that first day. The hermit simply showed him where he could sleep, a corner of the hut with a worn-out mat, and then pointed to 2 empty buckets. "The stream is 500 steps from here," he said, his voice surprisingly melodic for someone so austere. "We'll need water for today and tomorrow." And so began what the monk would soon realize was the true pattern of his learning on the mountain. Day after day, he carried water from the distant stream, gathered firewood, patched holes in the hut's roof, and prepared simple meals with whatever ingredients were available. Between tasks, he would sit with the hermit in absolute silence, watching the valley below or the clouds dancing above. For weeks, the monk performed these simple yet exhausting tasks, eagerly waiting for the great lessons to begin, for mystical secrets to be revealed. But there was only more work, more silence, more waiting. One night, as the stars seemed so close they could be touched, his frustration finally overflowed. "I came seeking wisdom, not to be your servant," the monk protested, setting his food down with unnecessary force before the hermit. "I've spent weeks carrying water, chopping wood, working like a beast of burden. When will the real teachings begin?" The hermit continued eating calmly, as if he hadn't heard the outburst. Only when he had finished his simple meal, wiping his plate with a piece of bread, did he turn his serene gaze to the agitated monk. "What do you believe a true teaching is?" he asked. The question caught the monk off guard. Words of wisdom, secret techniques, deep insights into the nature of the mind and reality, he replied, suddenly feeling the weight of his own expectations. The hermit looked up at the endless sky and spoke calmly. "The Enlightened One taught that we are composed of 5 aggregates. The body is only one of them form. The other 4 sensations, perceptions, mental formations, and consciousness are where true power resides." He paused, letting his words settle into the silence of the night. When you carry water, you are learning about all 5 aggregates at once. The resistance of the full bucket against your muscles teaches about form. The cold splash of water against your skin reveals the nature of sensations. The irritation that arises when you must take the same journey repeatedly shows how perceptions work. The thoughts that emerge along the way, "This is useless. I'm wasting my time. When will the real teaching begin?" are mental formations. And your ability to observe all of this happening is consciousness. The monk felt his face flush with a mix of shame and dawning understanding. There is no separation between mundane tasks and profound teachings, the hermit continued. That division exists only in a mind that has not yet learned to see reality as it is. He then told the story of the woman who lost her only child. Maddened by grief, she carried the boy's body for days, begging everyone for a medicine that could bring him back to life. When she finally reached the Enlightened One, he told her to bring a mustard seed from a house where no one had ever died. As she went from door to door in the village, she discovered a universal truth. Death touches everyone. She found not a single home untouched by loss. What changed was not her external reality. Her child remained dead, but her internal understanding of suffering as an experience shared by all beings. The hermit's eyes, reflecting the stars above, met the monk's. A mind that accepts suffering as part of life and still chooses compassion over despair. That is a truly invincible mind. He concluded. That night, the monk understood that the water he carried and the firewood he chopped were not distractions from the teaching, but the teaching itself in its purest form. The mountain, the stream, the simple hut, the repetitive tasks, they were the book through which the hermit imparted his deepest lessons. Time passed differently on the mountain. Days flowed into weeks and weeks into months, unmarked by the rigid schedules that governed life at the monastery. The monk lost track of how long he had stayed with the hermit. It could have been an entire season or merely a brief interval between 2 moons. In this timeless space, something new was growing within him. A calmness that did not depend on external circumstances, a clarity that remained even when his body was exhausted or uncomfortable. Each morning, began with silent meditation, watching the sunrise. Each night ended in contemplation of the infinite stars. Between these two moments of stillness, physical labor continued, no longer seen as an obstacle to learning, but as the very vehicle of understanding. The mind is not separate from the body, nor is the body separate from the world. The hermit explained one afternoon as they worked in the small garden that provided part of their food. When you plant a seed, your hand, the soil, the seed, the water, and your intention are all aspects of a single, indivisible reality. Gradually, the monk began to see how his old mental habits, particularly his pride in his physical strength and his impatience with what he considered weakness, had created an illusion of separation. He had built a strong and capable self that existed in opposition to others, rather than recognizing the fundamental interconnectedness of all things. One afternoon, as they meditated at the entrance of the hut, an unusual wind began to blow from the south. Dark clouds gathered on the horizon with alarming speed. "A storm is coming," the hermit said, opening his eyes. "And this is no ordinary storm." In the days that followed, the old sage's prediction proved devastatingly true. A storm of unmatched force descended upon the mountains, turning peaceful streams into raging torrents, uprooting ancient trees as if they were mere twigs, and sending avalanches of mud and stone crashing down the steep slopes. From the relative safety of the hut, built on a sheltered plateau, the monk and the hermit watched nature's fury unfold. There was nothing to do but wait for the storm to pass, listening to the deafening roar of the wind and the relentless pounding of rain against the wooden walls. On the third night, when the storm finally began to weaken, the hermit spoke. "Tomorrow, we must go down to the valley. Many will need help." At dawn, they carefully descended the now nearly unrecognizable trail, navigating landslides and fallen trees. As they approached the valley, the true impact of the storm became evident. Entire villages had been devastated, crops destroyed, lives shattered by the merciless wind. In the first village they reached, chaos reigned. The wounded moaned in the makeshift shelters, children cried out for missing parents, and the most able-bodied survivors struggled to organize some kind of response to the catastrophe, their faces marked by despair and exhaustion. Amid the turmoil and paralysis of fear, the monk discovered a surprising clarity within himself. Without hesitation, he approached what seemed to be the village leader, a middle-aged man attempting to coordinate the rescue efforts, and offered his help. In the days that followed, the monk worked tirelessly alongside the villagers. He used his physical strength to clear debris and build temporary shelters. But more importantly, he used his newfound mental serenity to remain calm in the midst of chaos, to think clearly when others were overwhelmed, and to inspire hope when despair threatened to consume hearts. The hermit helped as well, in subtler ways. His wrinkled hands treated wounds with medicinal herbs, and his serene voice comforted the terrified. At night, he told stories to the children who had lost everything, momentarily transporting them away from the horror that surrounded them. A week into their work in the valley, the monk realized something extraordinary. It was not his physical strength that made the crucial difference, though it certainly helped, but his ability to remain centered amidst external turbulence, like the still eye at the center of a hurricane. Observe how people turn to you for guidance, the hermit remarked one evening as they shared a simple meal after a long day's work. It is not just because of your physical strength, but because they sense your inner stability. The monk had noticed it too. Even men physically stronger than he sought his leadership in moments of crisis. Frightened children calmed in his presence. The elderly found comfort in his steady gaze. "This is true strength," the hermit continued. "Not the kind that resists the outer storm, but the kind that remains calm at the center of the inner storm. We all face the same devastation, but we do not all face it in the same way." One night, as the community rested after days of exhausting work, The hermit sat silently beside the monk by the communal fire. The flames danced in his wise eyes as he recited, "Just as the rain falls equally upon all plants, but each grows according to its nature, so too does the wisdom of the Enlightened One nourish all beings, but each flourishes according to their capacity." The monk pondered these words as he watched the flames turn wood into light and warmth. "True strength," the hermit continued, "is not in resisting the storm, but in being like water, able to take any shape, as gentle as dew or as powerful as a waterfall." At that moment, the monk recalled the story of the Enlightened One facing the tempter under the Bodhi tree. When challenged about his right to awakening, he simply touched the earth, calling it as witness to his journey. He had not conquered his greatest adversary with violence or physical force, but with the unwavering serenity of a perfectly balanced mind. As the weeks passed and the rebuilding progressed, the monk began to notice a transformation in the community around him. The disaster that had initially brought chaos and division was now forging stronger bonds between people who had barely known each other before the storm. Old disputes were forgotten in the face of shared need. Unexpected talents emerged from those once considered insignificant. "Do you see how adversity reveals our true nature?" the hermit asked one afternoon as they watched children playing among the ruins, finding joy even amidst devastation. For some, the storm brings out the best. For others, the worst. The difference is not in the storm, but in the mind that experiences it. One afternoon, while helping rebuild the roof of a house, the monk had a revelation. His entire life, he had trained his body to be strong, to resist, to dominate, as if the world were an opponent to be defeated. Now he understood that true strength was not in resisting the flow of life, but in moving with it, understanding its nature, and finding harmony even in chaos. The bamboo that bends with the wind survives the storm that breaks the rigid oak, he told himself, repeating an old proverb he now truly understood. As the first seeds were replanted in the fields and new foundations rose where there had been only rubble, the hermit announced that it was time to return to the mountain. "But there is still so much to do here," the monk protested, deeply invested in the community's reconstruction. The hermit smiled. "There is always more to do anywhere. The question is, what more do you need to learn here?" After months of aiding in the valley's reconstruction, the monk returned to the monastery in the mountains. The journey back was a time of deep reflection. Each step along the familiar trail carried the weight of experiences that had transformed not only his understanding but his very being. When he finally glimpsed the monastery walls against the mountain sky, he felt an unexpected emotion, not the sense of returning to a familiar place, but of arriving somewhere new with renewed eyes. The monastery was the same, but he was not. The other monks noticed the change immediately. Though his body was still strong, there was now a different quality to his presence, a rare combination of strength and gentleness, power and compassion. His gaze, once often focused on physical challenges, now seemed to see beyond the visible. "You have returned transformed," the old master observed during their first private meeting. It was not a question, but a statement. "Yes," the monk replied simply. "I went seeking strength and found something different from what I expected." "And what did you find?" the master asked, his ancient eyes gleaming with genuine curiosity. "That true strength does not lie in resisting the world, but in understanding it and flowing with it. That a strong body without a balanced mind is like a sharp sword in the hands of a child potent, yet dangerous even to the one who wields it." The old master smiled, as if he had been patiently waiting for years to hear these words. The following years brought a deep integration of these realizations. The monk now divided his time between physical and mental practices, finding a balance he had never known before. In the mornings, he still trained his body, not to achieve some ideal of physical strength, but to keep the vessel of his consciousness healthy and capable. In the afternoons, He practiced meditation and studied the ancient texts he had once considered unnecessary. And in the evenings, he shared his insights with the younger monks who sought his guidance. One spring, as the peach trees bloomed in the monastery orchard, a young monk approached him after the evening meditation. The boy bore a striking resemblance to his younger self, well-developed muscles, eyes burning with ambition, a body inclined toward action rather than contemplation. "They say you were once the strongest monk in these mountains," the young man said, barely concealing his admiration, "that you could break stones with your bare hands and defeat any opponent. I want to be like you were. Please, teach me." The older monk regarded the youth with a look of understanding and compassion. In him, he saw not only his past, but also the eternal cycle of learning that every human being must traverse in their own way and time. "Come with me," he said, rising with a fluid grace that surprised the young monk. Together, they walked beyond the monastery walls, following a path that wound through the forest until they reached a clearing where an ancient oak tree stood alone. Its gnarled roots emerged partially from the earth like veins on an elder's hand. Its massive trunk bore the scars of lightning and storms, yet it stood firm. Its branches stretched in all directions, supporting a canopy of green leaves that danced in the afternoon breeze. "What do you see?" the monk asked his young disciple. "A strong and imposing tree," the boy answered promptly. "And where does its true strength reside?" The young man hesitated, then pointed to the sturdy trunk. "There, at the center, where it is most solid." The monk smiled gently and knelt, touching the exposed roots that extended through the soil. "Its true strength is here, unseen to the eye. These roots stretch far beyond what we can see, reaching deep where they find water, even in the severest droughts. They are what keep this tree alive through storms that have toppled younger trees." Standing, the monk continued, "For years, I was like you, focused only on what was visible and impressive. I trained my body to its limits, believing that the stronger I became physically, the more invincible I would be. It took a humiliating defeat, a debilitating illness, and a devastating storm for me to understand what I now share with you." The young monk listened intently, though his eyes still betrayed a shadow of doubt. The Enlightened One taught in the Diamond Sutra that all things composed will eventually disintegrate. This body you admire, including mine, will one day weaken, like all things under the sky. But a mind cultivated in wisdom remains strong in the face of any adversity. He then shared the story of an ascetic named Kantivadi, the preacher of patience. When an arrogant king, angered by his teachings on nonviolence, ordered his limbs to be severed one by one, the ascetic maintained a mind of complete compassion and serenity. Even as his body was destroyed, his mind remained unshaken. "True strength," the monk said, "is not the ability to inflict suffering, but to remain centered when suffering inevitably comes to you." As they slowly made their way back to the monastery, he continued, "I am not saying you should abandon your physical training. A strong body is a blessing when used with wisdom. But understand that it is only a part of who you are and what you can become." The young monk walked in silence, absorbing words that, like seeds, might take years to fully sprout. The older monk recognized this silence. It was the same he had kept so many years ago when the old master had tried to plant similar seeds in his heart. Still unready. You don't have to wait for a humiliating defeat or a devastating illness to begin cultivating inner strength, the monk concluded. You can integrate this wisdom now, saving yourself years of unnecessary suffering. That night, after his conversation with the young disciple, the monk sat in meditation beneath the stars, which dotted the sky like thoughts in the vastness of consciousness. He reflected on his own journey, from a youth obsessed with physical strength to a man who finally understood the true nature of power. He recalled the old warrior who had defeated him in the tournament, the healer nun who had cared for him during his illness, the hermit who had taught him through simple tasks, and all the people he had met during the reconstruction after the storm. Each of them had been a different mirror, reflecting aspects of a truth he now saw with crystalline clarity. True strength had never been in tensed muscles or displays of power over others. It had never resided in rigid resistance or the domination of the outer world. True strength had always been in the flexibility of the mind that adapts without losing its essence, in the courage to remain open when fear urges one to close, in the serenity that persists even when everything around crumbles. As the Enlightened One taught in his final counsel, "Be a light unto yourselves. Seek refuge in yourselves. Do not seek refuge outside." The monk had found that inner light, which, unlike muscles that would one day wither, would only shine brighter as the seasons passed. As he gazed at the stars, one final realization arose in his heart. The journey from physical strength to mental strength was not a rejection of the body, but an expansion of consciousness to include deeper dimensions of experience. A strong body and an awakened mind are not opposites but companions in the great journey of life. True strength lies in the perfect balance between body and mind, between action and contemplation, between the individual and the collective. It is the ability to remain centered amidst chaos, to act decisively without being consumed by turmoil, to love deeply without being destroyed by inevitable loss. It is the courage to face reality as it is impermanent, interconnected, and beyond individual control, and yet live with joy and purpose. The monk smiled at the stars. His pursuit of strength had led him to a place he had never imagined, not to dominion over others or the world, but to an inner freedom that no external circumstance could compromise. In his quest to strengthen his body, he had discovered something infinitely more valuable, an invincible mind that, like infinite space, could never be wounded, captured, or destroyed. This was the message he now shared with all who crossed his path. True strength is not in resisting life's storms, but in finding peace at their center. Not in never falling, but in always rising. Not in avoiding suffering, but in transforming it into compassion and wisdom.